If the United States seizes Greenland by force, NATO falls, and if NATO falls, the world follows. Today, that scenario is no longer fiction. Much of the world still plays the old game of colonial geopolitics, including a shameless president steering a waning empire, too strong to resist, yet too weak to lead a new century, one who forces the modern world to the brink of World War III. Today, as we walk through the streets of a NATO ally, a fellow member whose citizens can no longer immigrate to the United States, two things are apparent to me. Colonialism is just as dangerous today as it was when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. If America takes Greenland by force to add it to its empire, the ripples of an uncertain future expand into waves that will wash across every shore. The ocean blue once carried empires to new worlds, but every conquest starts with a ripple, grows into a wave, and ends in a tsunami. If America seizes Greenland and her warming icy waters and extracts her resources best left for her people and future generations, that wave may be global war. My name is Scott Layton, an American expat in self-chosen exile here in Tirana, Albania, someone who fears for what his country has become. And this is a warning of what happens next and the threats of World War III if America takes Greenland by force. So, as we walk these leaf-covered streets in Tirana, a city shaped by empires past and pressured by empires present, let's talk about Greenland. Before we dive into the Arctic, let's look at a recent event that gives us a preview of what could happen if a superpower decides to act unilaterally. In January 2026, the United States military launched a high-level operation in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, transporting them to the U.S. for trial. This was not a covert hit. It was a public international operation that effectively removed a sitting head of state and has already been condemned by many as a violation of international law and sovereignty. Russian and South American leaders, along with legal scholars, called it what it was, a modern kidnapping carried out by a superpower with no multilateral approval. This is the new model of power projection. Seize territory or leadership unilaterally, justify it with vague appeals to national security. Let the global order adjust after the fact. Now imagine that same pattern, not in Caracas, but in Nuuk, Greenland. Greenland is not unclaimed land. After hundreds of years of colonialization, it is now a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, a full NATO member, and home to over 50,000 people, most of them indigenous Inuit, who do not want to become part of the United States. And yet, America has flirted with this idea for years. In 2026, open discussions by political leaders and media voices again raised the possibility, even the military option, of acquiring Greenland. This is not just rhetoric. If the United States tries to seize Greenland by force, it will be an attack on an ally. And if that happens, NATO dies. It may not be with tanks, but with planes, operatives, and legal sleight of hand, with U.S. bases already stationed in Thule and political pressure mounting, it might not take a full-scale invasion, just one sudden action, and the map redraws itself. NATO is built on one promise: an attack on one is an attack on all. But if a founding NATO member, the United States, attacks Denmark or forcibly takes Greenland, then NATO faces an unsolvable crisis. Does Europe invoke Article 5 against Washington? Does it remain silent and let America get away with conquest? Do member states fracture and form new coalitions? There is no scenario where NATO survives that intact. If NATO fractures, the consequences won't be abstract. They will be immediate and potentially irreversible. The collapse of the Western Alliance would open the door to regional conflict, renewed invasions, and a dramatic expansion of authoritarian influence, beginning with countries already in Moscow's sights. Russia's brutal war against Ukraine is already underway, unprovoked, illegal, and grinding into its fourth year. Millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead. And if NATO fails to stand, the next dominoes fall even faster. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states, sit directly on Russia's western border and have long been targets of Kremlin propaganda, cyber attacks, and military intimidation. Without NATO's protection, Putin could march into the Baltics with minimal resistance, triggering chaos across Europe. Moldova remains vulnerable, with Russian troops entrenched in the breakaway region of Transnistria. With NATO fractured, Moscow would have free rein to destabilize or absorb it entirely. In Georgia, two provinces, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, are already under Russian occupation. A renewed offensive would be a matter of when, not if. Kosovo faces increasing pressure from Serbia, emboldened by Russian support and rising Balkan nationalism that risks igniting a new conflict in a region still haunted by war. Bosnia and Herzegovina stands on a knife's edge. The Serb-majority Republika Srpska, backed by Moscow, is pushing for secession. A weakened NATO may be unable or unwilling to stop it from spiraling into bloodshed. Finland and Sweden, NATO's newest members, have already experienced Russian cyber intrusions, airspace violations, and disinformation campaigns, as well as attacks to their undersea fiber optic cables and energy infrastructure. Finland shares an 800-mile border with Russia. The Kremlin views their NATO membership as provocation and will look to exploit any perceived weakness. Poland, already under pressure from hybrid warfare and military exercises near its borders, would become a corridor, a bulwark, or a battlefield, possibly all three. Romania, a Black Sea frontline state, faces growing risks from Russian aggression and regional instability. If NATO falters, Romania becomes a target, not just a participant, in the next front. Inside the alliance, Slovakia's government has tilted toward Moscow. If NATO fractures, it's not just outside threats we must fear, but internal ones, from leaders willing to trade democratic solidarity for authoritarian favor. Even these streets we're walking on in Tirana are unsafe from growing Russian threats. Albania, a proud NATO member since 2009, sits at a geopolitical crossroads. As instability grows in the Balkans, Albania's role becomes more vulnerable. Russian disinformation, cyber probes, and proxy influence campaigns have already touched the region. And if NATO splinters, Albania could find itself isolated. A democracy surrounded by nations sliding into chaos or co-opted by foreign powers. This is not theory. These are live threats. Some are already active. Others are waiting for the signal that NATO is no longer capable or no longer willing to defend its members. And all of them become more dangerous if America seizes Greenland by force, shatters the alliance, and shows the world that might makes right once again. Because when alliances break, tyrants act. And when tyrants act, they don't stop at borders. They redraw them. A fractured NATO would not just destabilize Europe. It would shift the balance of power across the entire globe. Nowhere is that shift more immediate, more strategic, and more complex than in China's expanding sphere of influence. A distracted America can't lead in Asia. And Beijing knows it. If NATO breaks, the message is clear. The Western alliance is no longer reliable. The global rules no longer apply, and China may no longer feel the need to pretend they do. Taiwan, already under constant military intimidation, would face existential danger. Chinese warships and aircraft are already testing Taiwan's airspace and waters daily. A U.S. bogged down in transatlantic instability may no longer be able or willing to defend Taipei. In the South China Sea, China is building militarized islands, expanding its maritime claims, and pushing against the sovereignty of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. With America distracted or diminished, China could fully assert control over these trade arteries, through which 1/3 of the world's shipping passes. But the threat doesn't stop at the water's edge. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has created a global web of influence through debt, infrastructure, and soft power diplomacy. From ports in Sri Lanka, to railways in Africa, to highways in Latin America, China is quietly redrawing global loyalties, financing dependency one contract at a time. This isn't just economic expansion, it's geopolitical alignment. And while America postures, China owns around $800 billion of U.S. national debt. That leverage, combined with its growing alliances, gives Beijing the power to disrupt global markets, manipulate supply chains, and assert dominance in new global institutions. And here's a scary question for you. What would happen if China demands to be repaid and Trump refuses? We must be honest about what all this means. A fragmented West gives China the diplomatic room to rewrite international norms. A weakened NATO reduces deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. An America seen as unstable or aggressive pushes the rest of the world toward Beijing's model. What begins with a Greenland crisis could end with a new world order, one where authoritarian coordination replaces democratic cooperation, and where the next great conflict begins not with tanks or missiles, but with ports, debts, and maps quietly redrawn. A fractured Western alliance signals the rules no longer apply. History warns us of the escalating dangers we face today. The French and Indian War, as it's called in America, didn't begin in Paris or London. It began with American settlers violating treaties, seizing land, and undermining the sovereignty of the Iroquois and other native nations. That localized aggression triggered a chain reaction, drawing Britain and France into open war. What started in the Ohio Valley became the 7 Years' War, the first truly global conflict spanning 5 continents. It led to the American and French revolutions, to Napoleon, to Trafalgar, to modern nation-states, and yet more revolutions, where empires fell and colonies shifted. The world was redrawn. That pattern didn't stop there. World War I didn't begin in Berlin. It began in Sarajevo with the nationalist assassination in the Balkans and tangled alliances that couldn't hold. Its aftermath shattered empires, humiliated Germany, and left millions dead. In that vacuum of grief and economic collapse, Nazism rose, offering scapegoats, identity, and revenge. World War II didn't begin with Pearl Harbor. It began with a rising Germany seizing neighboring lands under the banner of unity and destiny, while other nations stayed silent, eager to appease or collaborate until the world was on fire. This is how global wars start, not with tanks and capitals, but with sovereignty ignored, with one nation pushing the line and the world hesitating to push back. That's why the United Nations was created, as a bulwark against this very pattern. And that's why U.S. moves against Greenland are such a threat to the world today. Let's be absolutely clear. Supporting sovereignty is not colonialism. Greenland has the right to self-determination. So does Denmark. So does every nation, large or small. Greenland is not some barren frontier. It is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, and a living homeland for a proud indigenous people. Most of Greenland's 50,000 citizens are indigenous Inuit, a people who have long resisted domination by foreign powers. They've made it clear they do not want to become part of the United States, and whether they choose full sovereignty or remain within Denmark, that decision belongs to them, and them alone. Colonialism is a blight on the human condition and a sin of every empire, and we know its consequences, be it Denmark's forced contraception campaign on the Inuit, or America's brutal land grabs, wars, and genocide on their native peoples. An attack on Greenland will be manifest destiny under a red MAGA cap that a vast majority of Americans do not support. Taking Greenland by force would violate every principle of international law. It would end American credibility, spark massive global backlash, and possibly ignite open war. NATO, the EU, and the UN must clearly warn, any attempt to seize Greenland by force, even by a founding ally, is an act of aggression. The Security Council is outdated. 5 nations control the fate of billions. When Maduro was taken, there was no functional recourse. Greenland could be next. The Council must be restructured, reduce permanent veto power, include voices from the Global South, or abolish the Security Council altogether, and rebuild the United Nations into the democratic institution the world desperately needs. A United Nations that truly represents the world, with equality, justice, compassion, and reason, and the authority to enforce peace. A United Nations with teeth. A United Nations that defends sovereignty in deed, not just in word. Maybe it's time we begin looking beyond national sovereignty and toward our collective individual sovereignty. For more on that, watch The Social Contract of the Commons and the Universal Declaration on Equality, Human Rights, and Justice. Because the problem isn't just failing states, it's a broken framework for who holds power and why. We deserve better than fear. We deserve better than silence or neglect. We deserve a plan and a future worth planning for. We need coalitions based on shared values, not just military convenience. Alliances must defend sovereignty, include small and medium powers, prevent great power impunity. Here in Tirana, I walk among the ruins of empires. Ottoman, Italian, Communist, NATO. They all believed they were permanent, but nothing lasts forever, especially not alliances that betray their own principles. The U.S. operation in Venezuela showed the world how power can override process. But Greenland would be something different. A trigger, a betrayal, a breaking point. If America becomes the kind of empire it once rebelled against, if it seizes allies and undermines its own alliances, then World War III won't be a question of if, but when. This is the hour of choice. The world is watching, with bated breath and rising fear. The next move matters. Let it be one of cooperation. Let it be one of restraint. Let it be one of justice. One where every peoples has the sacred right and responsibility to help write their own destiny, and one where all have the tools and the resources and the voices to steer it. If you care about sovereignty, dignity, and the rule of law, speak now, before the next ripple, wave, or tsunami becomes the norm. Because the question isn't just what America will do, it's whether the world will have the courage to stop it, before the ripples become a war no one can contain. This is not the time for silence, collaboration, or appeasement. This is the time for reason, compassion, and action. This is Scott Layton. I speak not as a strategist, not as a politician, but as someone who still believes in what America once claimed to stand for. I hope it can still remember. This is the Renaissance spirit, and this is the hour of choice. Let's choose wisely. The fate of the world may hinge on what we do next. Let our actions be clear, let them be just, and above all, let them be loud.